We are live. Welcome, everybody. I am Fred Gouveia. This is our Conversations Around the Fire on Spirit Reflections, where we gather around that ancestral fire in the middle of a forest at night, in the wilderness, surrounded by the community that we trust, that we rely on to survive. And as we gather around that fire, literally as we speak, we are here in New York City. We're hearing outside our windows the applause for the doctors, the nurses, the people in the front lines every 7 o'clock. You hear people are screaming, they're playing their instruments, they're clapping. It's this tsunami of gratitude that just washes over Manhattan in a really beautiful way. So we want to take our surfboards and catch a ride on this awesome wave of positivity and recognition, and continue to talk about spirit reflections in these conversations around the fire, where the sacred fire of creativity, purification, renewal will awaken in us new memories, new ideas. And we look up into the sky at night and we wonder what's out there. And this is the idea of our conversations around the fire. And tonight I'm really pleased and honored to have a dear friend, Emma Bragdon, Dr. Emma Bragdon. And I'm going to read her quick bio here so that you know who we're talking about, and you guys can hear the screams outside. We're gonna let it go, keep the window open because it just adds to the fun. So Emma Bragdon, PhD, is the executive director of a not-for-profit online learning platform on integrative mental health, Integrative Mental Health University, imhu.org, which just completed seven years, right?
Yes.
Awesome.
May 11th.
Congratulations. So they offer 34 presentations on effective ways to improve mental health without over-relying on psychiatric medications. Emma has been profoundly impacted by her 20 years of study of Spiritism in Brazil. She has written several books on Spiritist therapies in Brazil and co-produced 2 films on this topic, which I must say I had a chance to read a couple of your books, Kardec Spiritism and Resources for Extraordinary Healing, and I was really moved by it. So without further ado, Emma, our hug to you. Heartfelt welcome.
Thank you, Fred. Thanks so much.
Emma, so tonight's conversation around the fire is called Spiritual Awakening and Mental Health, or Mental Health and Spiritual Awakening. Which one comes first, right? Well,
that's an interesting question in and of itself. So, Fred, we were sharing a little bit a few minutes ago about our personal stories, right?
Right.
And I would say what came first for me was a deep connection to nature. That was where I felt something very special was going on when I was a kid.
Okay.
And then I realized I went there for escape. And what was I escaping from? Some of the dysfunction in my own family, some of the questions that I had that weren't being answered. And I was what is today known as a highly sensitive person, HSP.
HSP.
Yes, a highly sensitive person. And I could sense what was going on with other people, even though they weren't divulging that information. And I thought, well, why aren't people really, talking about what's really going on for them? I don't understand. They're pretending that one thing's happening, but I can feel something else is happening. And so anyway, I became very concerned about that. And when I was about 16 years old, I actually became very depressed, deeply depressed. And part of it was my parents were separating. And the family was breaking up, and they were getting rid of our 3 dogs that I loved, and all those things that are deeply disturbing for a young person. But it was something else too. It threw me into, so what's this life about anyway?
Right.
And I remember looking out the window, sitting by the window, and thinking, so why don't I just kill myself? I mean, what is there here? So I felt that spirit was guiding me when I was a youngster, but then on the other hand, that compelling moment or moments of really asking that question, what's life about? So I never seriously cut myself, and I never went to a psychiatrist, and I had learned not to divulge to other people what was really going on inside of me, because it just I just felt it would lead to some problems that I didn't want to have.
Right.
So 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 fortunately, and I consider that I've had hugely great good fortune throughout my life. By the time I was 18, I was traveling in Europe with a person that I was deeply in love with, and he said, "Let me teach you meditation."
Aha, meditation. That
Yeah.
was the first tool that came across your path.
Yes, it was the first tool. And so I sat down to meditate with him, and within minutes, I actually went into a state of ecstasy
Wow.
at 18. And I thought, just like in those minutes or seconds, I thought, oh, okay, whatever this is, I want more. And it's going to be the cornerstone of my life.
And were you guys out in nature? Were you in a
No,
close space?
well, we were inside, but nature was around us. And
Okay.
and in fact, we were on an island. And
Oh,
so
beautiful.
surrounded by ocean.
Nice.
And he didn't have the same experience I did. So I questioned, like, what's going on? What is this all about?
Right.
And he didn't really give me guidance because he hadn't experienced anything like it. But the door had flung open onto something. And I have to say, too, that in growing up, I had several different near-death experiences.
Oh, really?
So those experiences propelled me into seeing life from a very different vantage point, which was very...
What prompted those near-death experiences, Emma? Was it any particular condition or?
Almost drowning, almost suffocating,
Accidents.
Yeah.
Wow.
Things like that.
Wow.
So, so anyway, I guess that was a stepping stone into something that I experienced in meditation, which was, this big place of light that I saw in my near-death experience. That's here too in meditation. And so since my friend didn't have the experience, I started thinking to myself, I need some guidance here. I need to connect with other people who have this similar experience. So again, with great good fortune, I have my mother's sister, who I called Aunt H, who was already involved with Zen Buddhist meditation.
Okay.
So I was given the opportunity to go to some retreats and learn from a Zen Buddhist priest. And I thought, okay, someone out there knows something about this. I'm okay now. But within a couple years, I was actually in California, part of the San Francisco Zen Center, and studying under a self-realized master, Suzuki Roshi, who wrote Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind.
Uh-huh.
So you see, there's a progression of just tremendous good fortune. And so I went on a 3-month retreat, and a lot happened during that time, and it galvanized my relationship with my teacher, Suzuki, and also some of the other teachers who were there. But some of our boo-boos never escape us, right? Some of our
as hard as we try to ignore them, right?
Our pains,
get
dragged along in a bag with us, even though we might want to offload it.
Right.
So I started to become aware in my meditation, actually, that sometimes I would just shake all over. I didn't know what it was all about. And then I became aware of just some other feelings that I had, and I didn't know where they were coming from. And a friend of mine said, well, why don't you try Neo-Reichian therapy, also known as a kind of breath work.
Okay.
But it was done one-on-one with a practitioner.
How do you spell that? Or
it's Neo, Neo, dash, and then Reichian, Reichian.
Okay.
So
it
follows the philosophy of Wilhelm Reich, a German who did some extraordinary work. So anyway, I followed that advice, found a fantastic therapist, and I started doing this particular kind of breath work. I think in today's world, people would be more familiar with the term somatic experiencing.
Okay, somatic experience coming from the psychosomatic word, right?
Yeah, or somatic coming from the body, working with the body experience.
Working with the body.
So
Okay.
the idea that actually came from Reich is that we hold pain in our body if we haven't been in a, let's say, social situation growing up, social conditioning, where we could fully express our feelings. So if we felt it was unsafe, we'd kind of put it down, we'd repress it, but it would stick in our body someplace, literally. So the trauma would, I mean, we call it baggage, but as if we're carrying it,
right?
We carry it in our bodies,
right?
So I had the great good fortune of doing this Reichian therapy, and which catalyzed a lot of catharsis,
right?
So I could unload some of my baggage, right?
Yeah.
And the more unloaded of my baggage I got, the happier I got. And then I also was thinking, well, wait a minute. I'd like to do both. I want that ecstasy that comes from meditation, and I want that just happiness that seems to come from unloading my personal baggage.
Just a side comment on the word catharsis. I had a chance I love to examine the etymology and the meanings of words. Catharsis shares the root with cathedral. And when you think about that, they built these temples for centuries and centuries and centuries for people to enter into a sacred space and be able to somehow cleanse, somehow purify, somehow renew themselves in a cathedral. So when I hear catharsis, I associate with this sacred inner experience that happens too, right? When you're able to unload, as you said. So, yeah.
Makes me think of the Cathars as well. An esoteric Christian group. But that's a whole other story, isn't it?
Well, I'm just typing things in here for our audience to do their Google searches later on. So
yeah. So anyway, that happened all in my early 20s, and then in some ways we could say fortune smiled again. But when I was 24, 25, I got married, and immediately thereafter, and I married a Zen Buddhist person who was moving towards the priesthood.
Oh, that's from East to West movement?
No, he's an American man.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, but shortly thereafter, personal chaos happened in our lives. And so that meant my mother passed away. While I was 7 months pregnant, my son was born. And then my teacher died, Suzuki died. And anyway, there was
all at the same time
in the family. In that year, my father also died. So it was just very chaotic. But I had this support structure of a spiritual community. 1, my meditation. 2, fantastic therapist that helped me through the grieving process, and my son who was depending on me. And I loved being a mother. Loved it.
Nice.
So that was good therapy.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was a very difficult time, but I also had in my mind, I had some kind of structure for what's life about? What's the meaning of life? And where do I want to go? What's meaningful for me? What's my life purpose?
Right.
So it's spiritual. And I wanted to move towards what is called enlightenment or self-realization.
Right.
Which is, developing more compassion, more wisdom. Can't say I've gotten there yet, Fred.
It's a long journey.
I'm on the way. So anyway, I was fortunate at 25 when I went through that year that was really a hell realm, that I had all of these resources.
Nice.
And I would highly recommend for anyone, any of the resources that I've mentioned so far.
Yeah.
Now, I want to take a pause, Fred, and ask you if you'd like to tell the story.
Absolutely. We were talking before we went live about the sharing of our personal journeys. And my personal journey, for those that I've never shared it on our channel here, is in my early 20s, I went into a severe depression as a result of my sexuality, that I was not accepting that identity. And I was doing everything I could to run away from it. And that included nervous breakdowns, paranoia, thinking that people were persecuting me, and deep, deep sadness, insecurities all around. And it culminated in this total blank that I had for 3 days, that I didn't want to interact with the world, because what had happened was my mother discovered some magazines that I had of gay men. Mm-hmm. I wasn't ready to come out. Mm-hmm. And by that, I was so shocked by that discovery that I shut down. I said, in my psyche, I said, I'm not relating with the world anymore. My parents were obviously very concerned. They took me to a psychiatrist in Miami, Florida at the time. And after 2 or 3 sessions, that I just did not interact with the guy, because he was an openly gay psychiatrist. And their intention probably was, okay, maybe this is an issue that he has. Let's take him to somebody that is a specialist in the area. But I wasn't ready to come out to the world, or even to myself. And so I shut down. And after a lot of conversation and him trying to get me to talk, he finally turned to my parents and said, there is a possibility that your son might be developing schizophrenia. And if that's the case, we need to put him in a psychiatric institution. My father was always very reactive and explosive. And so he said, the hell with this. We're going to Brazil. We're going to find something there to get him fixed. So after all the exams you can imagine in the hospital, and MRIs and you name it, there was also these spiritual therapies, which, as you know, being in Brazil, are so part of the culture and the social dialogue, much more than in other parts of the world, definitely much more than the United States, I would say. And it was in those months that I stayed there, confined to a hotel room, because I would wake up at night sometimes and just want to go to the window and try to kill myself. And my parents found a hotel where the windows literally open no more than 6 inches, so that they could sleep through the night. And then in one of those nights, I had these visions, because they had asked for prayers in spiritualist centers, especially Umbanda, which is more of an Afro-Brazilian spiritualist traditions. And I was doing the prayers, reading the Psalms, but still in deep distress, deep pain. Until one day I just turned to my mother and I asked her, who is Allan Kardec? Now, my parents had no background in Spiritism. They did not participate in any Spiritist center. They were what you call your leisure Catholics, that just say something when somebody asks what your religion is, just to fit in. And that just popped into my mind. Ask who Allan Kardec is. I asked. I purchased a copy of the Spirits book. And after that, one day I woke up in the morning. We were doing prayers every night before I go to sleep. And they had suggested we put a bottle of water next to the bed and pray for the spirit doctors to use that water and magnetize it with healing energy. And one day when I had started reading the book and I had this like catharsis, insight, if you will. The next morning, I kid you not, the bottle of water looked like the water was sparkling. It was completely sparkling, like gaseous. I swallowed the water. It tasted like medicine. After that, Emma, I never had any severe issues again. You go through your ups and downs and your emotional turmoils, but after that, never again, thankfully. So that's my spiritual tool that came to me. It was Spiritism back then. And so.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, as you know, Spiritism has been a big part of my life, and I was drawn to Brazil to understand more about it. And
that's a curiosity I'd like to have before you mention, how did you actually get to it? Like, what was the first thing that prompted you to say, I want to know more about it?
Well, I never learned anything about it in graduate school. which
Okay.
when I got to Brazil and I started learning about it, I was totally stunned. I thought, I must have been asleep. What happened? Where was I? I know they talked about it. Where was I? But, the fact of the matter is they didn't talk about it. And nobody in my graduate school knew anything about it. As far as I could tell, there's certainly no conversation. And I've been a student of comparative religions. I've got a lot of books in my bookcase on comparative religions. Since I've been to Brazil, I've gone through all of those and said, okay, where's Spiritism? Where's Spiritism? Wasn't mentioned.
Wow.
So how I got there is by invitation. I was teaching a 9-day course called the Avatar course, which it was really about supporting people in spiritual growth and personal growth and helping them unload baggage. And it's a wonderful course that also brings people into a lot of deep connection.
Well, the Avatar course, right?
Support as they're doing this offloading as well as, expansion. So I was a master teacher at that point and was invited to go to Brazil to help other teachers feel more confident in their teaching. So I went, and after the course, I had been encouraged to go meet John of God.
Right.
And so I went to the place where he was working. And
the central plains of Brazil, near the capital, Brasilia.
Yes, near Brasilia. And I had a very strong experience that first day of interacting with him. It basically was, the energy was so strong, yeah. I had a hard time standing up. I had a friend there, and I was totally safe. But after I had the interaction with John of God, I went outside, and I was just sitting there for a while, and several mediums who I'd never met before in my life, totally strange to me, walked up to me and said, "Oh, you're here because you're going to be a voice that brings Spiritism to the rest of the world." And Fred, I said to them, "I think you've got the wrong person."
This was in the 90s, I believe, right?
This was in the early 2000s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Or I didn't say that. I just said, "Well, thank you very much." But I just thought they're all mistaken. This is, and then I started asking some other people, like, what are they talking about? I've never heard of Spiritism. What is it? So,
and by the way, in that place, there are people from all over the world. It's not like they picked you out because you looked American. Oh, maybe we can talk to her. No, like there's more foreigner people than Brazilians at that place. Yeah.
At that time.
At the time, yes. So yeah, now it's no longer, yeah.
Yes. So at that particular time, 2001, there were a lot of foreigners there. So it wasn't like I was the only one, but somehow these people, who I later realized were all mediums, came up and said this to me. And you know what? That same night, I was introduced to a woman who was leading a large conference in Sao Paulo on transpersonal psychology. Wow. And she wanted me to come and visit in Sao Paulo so she could introduce me to the leaders in Spiritism in Sao Paulo. And I just thought, what's going on here? Like, who's running this stage? I get it. Who's pulling the strings? Where's the public here? What's happening? So, I said, thank you very much. And I did go and visit her, and I met some wonderful people and had some great experiences. And then it got the ball rolling. I got really interested. People were extremely welcoming and kind. I was learning things that were extremely important because Spiritism does know how to bring together mental health and spiritual growth.
Yeah.
In a way that we don't have in the United States. So I was just absorbing it as fast as I could, learning about it as fast as I could. And then actually for the next 12 years, I would learn as much as I could in Brazil for 6 months out of the year, and then go back to the United States, write books or create documentary films on Spiritism, and then go back to Brazil. So I was very extroverted in Brazil. and a hermit when I was in the United States. Still meditating, but, leading a very reclusive life so that I could focus.
Right.
Anyway, that answers your question, how to get into Spiritism. And what I could, let's see, do you have a question for me other than that, or shall I?
Well, I'm curious that I'm trying to find the best one to ask here. There are quite a few, but for instance, in the book that you wrote, Kardec Spiritism, which I believe was the first one you published on the subject, right?
Yeah, well, yes, more or less. I actually wrote a book about what was going on at the Casa Dominatio.
Okay.
Spiritual Alliances.
Spiritual Alliances, that's right.
As you and I both know, it's not really a Spiritist center.
We met because I read your book. I found your book online, and I said, wow, this is written by an American. It's in English, and it's called Kardec Spiritism. Hold on, who is this woman? I have to get to know her. I have to reach out to her. And we actually met in Sao Paulo. We spent a couple of days there, and we went to a Spiritist psychiatric hospital that was affiliated with the Spiritist Center, where we spent an afternoon with a lovely gentleman who was the founder of the institution, and talking about mediumship and the presence of the spirit phenomena in helping them carry out their work. And that was a very impactful weekend that I was there during the time. It was in my early days of Spiritism also. And my question, you had mentioned that Spiritism does this bridge of bringing mental health and spiritual growth in a really unique way. In your works of comparative religions and other philosophies and traditions, what would you say today is the closest thing to it that is in the collective conscious here or unconscious of the Americans or the North Americans, the English-speaking world, I guess? Is there one?
I think that there's a great hunger today for people to reach into some higher wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And they do it in a lot of different ways. And channeling has become quite popular. And learning about psychics has become quite popular. And so through that avenue, people are beginning to say, well, wait a minute, maybe reincarnation really does exist.
Right.
And maybe I really can converse with, or someone can converse with people in my family who have passed away. And, all kinds of things that we find in Spiritism, people are finding in the United States, but through a different route.
Right.
They don't go to a Spiritist center necessarily. They go to a psychic, or they watch a psychic being interviewed on TV or
a series
like that. And then there are medical intuitives that have become very popular. And so that's all going on. But in terms of people getting some kind of an overarching philosophy, and also one of the things that is so strong in the Brazilian Spiritism is, if we want to evolve on a spiritual level, then we have to really look at our morals and ethics.
Right.
And so that's not to say everybody should, let's moralize and let's be hard on each other and let's realize that God really is judgmental and punitive.
Exactly.
But instead,
to
recognize within ourselves that if we want more compassion and wisdom, then maybe we need to make some changes in the way that we show up in the world. And so I think as people are finding their way into a kind of spirituality that maybe doesn't have an ism attached to it, it's not like a philosophy that's all knit together.
Right.
That they're becoming fascinated by all of these spiritual kinds of things that are more available on TV and YouTube and social media and whatever.
It's interesting that
umbrella that Spiritism has to offer.
It's a very, very, very structured set of books and information that gives sort of a very easy way to approach these questions that people are finding through other avenues like shows and psychic developments and things like that. And when you mentioned regarding the morals and the ethics, I think one of the most beautiful byproducts of that principle in action is when you examine that the Spiritist centers all over Brazil are so attached to community assistance, community work, volunteer work in the form of soup kitchens, orphanages, hospitals, whatever, the homeless shelters. There is such a prevalent concern for that to be the core of the work. And then the philosophical, the intellectual is a part of that mix, but the charity part is very much in the core of it, right?
Yeah, and I think also, for people in the United States who are finding their way into this fascinating territory of spirituality, or talking to spirits, or channeled wisdom, that they don't get that piece that is fundamental in Spiritism, which has to do with the huge amount of growth that can come from volunteer work and
Right.
helping other people.
And you mentioned you had a spiritual community when you were 25 that supported you in your chaotic year. That's also something that I think is helpful when you do become part of a community, an intentional group that gathers in order to offer that kind of support for each other. So you can totally do the meditations, the inner work alone, and I think that's super valid as well. And in addition, you got to be able to balance community into it, right?
Yeah, I would say that the community for me, spiritual community, in other words, being with, I'll call them birds of a feather,
Yeah.
who have all decided that what they really want is spiritual growth in this life, and hopefully a kind of communion with either we call it God or source, or some people would say Christ is one that offers us that kind of communion so that we can then develop. So to be able to affiliate with people, and they may come from very different traditions, but to affiliate with people who've decided, yep, that's what I want in life. Yep, count me in.
Yep.
That's been just tremendous, and was really my safety net when I went through that very hard year in my 20s.
And it's funny, we attended in Salt Lake City an interfaith congress, I would say 5-6 years ago. And we had a booth that was offering free books on Allan Kardec, on Chico Xavier, all in English. There must have been, I don't know, 500 volumes that we carried there. And interestingly, we had people from all walks of life, very open, but none of them had heard anything about Spiritism either at the time. Yeah. And what we found, though, there was a couple of interactions that were quite explosive, coming from, I don't want to say fundamentalist, but more traditional Christian groups that look at the word itself, Spiritism, as devil worship, or as communicating with the dead and breaking the law of Moses. And actually having biblical translations saying don't practice Spiritism, written by men that lived 2,000 years ago, when the word actually is 160 years old. It didn't even exist back then, right? So I find that's one of the big challenges for people to be open to the idea of Spiritism, or even have the courage to go to a center if they have one near them. Because if they Google Spiritism in English, other than the Kardec's bio and some centers' websites, everything else is devil worship, and for the most part.
Yeah. Woo-woo.
Woo-woo, yeah.
Yeah.
So the reason I asked this perhaps is, how are you able to bridge in your work, helping at Integrative Mental Health University, helping both practitioners that assist patients in their spiritual emergencies and emergencies, I guess, overcome this, if there is something to be overcome regarding the perceived negative association that the word Spiritism has, or is that an assumption of mine? I don't know.
Well, let's see if I can address your question. So one of the things we at IMHU, there are about 34 different courses, and one that's very popular is how to effectively support someone in spiritual emergency. Mm-hmm. So an example of a spiritual emergency actually might be someone who's had a near-death experience, and they might have been, really interested in buying a fancy car and having a really nice house and eating really good food and going to restaurants a lot before they had this near-death experience. But after they have the near-death experience and survived, and had this enlightening experience, which most people do with a near death, they say, wait a minute, I want to live from my soul, not from my ego.
Right.
I don't care about impressing people about my house or my car so much as I do about really asking myself, what's in my heart of hearts, and how can I, kind of grow that? And how can I associate with other people like me who want to do the same? So, anyway, that becomes extremely important. And the people who are drawn to take this course, how to effectively support someone in spiritual emergency, want to learn how to bring someone who's had a crisis, and the near-death experience can be a real crisis because you end up reevaluating your whole life, all your relationships, your work, how you do your family, how you take care of yourself. All of that can come up into question. It becomes a real turning point for people. So the people drawn to that course are interested in their own experience, but also the experience of loved ones who might be going through this process.
Right.
Or their psychologists or psychotherapists saying, wait a minute, I think some of the people that I'm talking to are in a spiritual emergency. They aren't sick. They're in a spiritual emergency. Maybe you were, in the story that you told.
No, for sure.
Yeah. So anyway, within that course, there are 5 online webinars. And during one webinar, I talk about Spiritism. And I'll tell you, 100% of the people will say, wow,
right,
that exists. That's amazing. Can we go? Can I go? When's the next plane? I want to see it in action. There's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm about it.
Because you do take people down to Brazil to visit Spiritist psychiatric hospitals, right?
Yes, but I can't take everyone who's interested.
Right.
Because some people are like, want to do it as almost as a tourist, like, hey, I want to see this place. But, just like psychiatric hospital wouldn't accept tourists here.
Sure.
Because, you want to respect the privacy of the people in a psych hospital. So I have an affiliation with a hospital there. In fact, they call me their ambassador. And so my promise to them is I will only bring healthcare providers.
Nice. Yeah.
And people who are doing something, they're agents of change in their community. They want to bring something new into their community in terms of how we do mental health care.
And Emma, share with some of the people that are watching, please, what have you discovered as in your research, or what have some of been the most compelling, I don't know if they're data points or things that you were able to measure in your findings in these trips to Brazil that I remember you did a lecture for us in New York at our Inner Enlightenment Center a few years ago where you were talking about that. What were some of the most compelling things you saw in those institutions?
Well, some of the most unusual things happen when mediums get together and they are able to focus on one particular patient at a time. So these mediums have been highly trained in order to work with people and help them, these people who are quite disturbed and are in the hospital, a psychiatric hospital. So they've had to go through a lot of training, sometimes 10 or 20 years.
Right.
And part of the training is for them to really unload anything that might trigger them on an emotional level so they can be really clear and clean and given the opportunity then to focus on patient in the hospital. They aren't going to project their own stuff on that person, but instead have more clear vision about what's going on with that person. And what I saw going on, and I've visited many of those Spiritist psychiatric hospitals in Brazil, and I've seen many of the mediums working together in teams. But one of the times I'm thinking about right now, they were focusing on someone that they never met. That person was in, Ward C on the other side of the campus or something. So they didn't even have to see that person physically. but they could focus in on that person and then come up with information about the real cause of that person's disturbance. And the cause might not be in this lifetime even. It might have been in another lifetime. And they could so not only perceive what was going on, but they could, in some cases, come up with what needed to happen for the treatment of that particular person. And for how long does that particular treatment need to go on? And other things of a very esoteric nature, which I don't really want to go into right now. But I was so deeply impressed by the lack of ego in this group working together, 8 to 10 people working together, meditating in a way where they would focus intently for about an hour and a half on one person after another, maybe 3 patients within that hour and a half, and really come up with some very explicit information, some of the mediums being medical intuitives.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I was in, it would bring me to tears sometimes to see the collaboration going on and to recognize they were all volunteers. They weren't paid for any of it. And the other thing that impressed me is that a guy in a lab coat or a woman in a lab coat would come in, and you could see on their, identifier, Dr. So-and-so, psychiatrist, blah, blah, blah. They were respectful of the mediums, as in they were working together in teamwork as equals, even though one had been academically trained, going through medical school, and had a certain way of viewing, the patients, and the mediums who had a completely different orientation in terms of recognizing what was going on with someone, but they valued each other's perspectives and worked together. So anyway, there's several different things that really impressed me. And also within the Spiritist psychiatric hospitals, they do a form of energy work. It wasn't the breath work that I described that was part of my own experience, but it was working with energy, recognizing that people do store things in their body, or there are obstructions of energy in the body that need to be diluted.
Released.
Maybe not through an emotion, but through some other way. So it was very, very similar. And we don't have a lot of respect for energy work in our psychiatric hospitals.
Right.
To say that in a kind way. I'm just amazed that we don't have that kind of, because I saw people loving it. And I saw people in the psychiatric hospital also being able to get water that had been blessed by the mediums and was considered medicine.
And there's actually enough evidence out there that this integrative approaches to the treatment do have better success rates, quicker recovery, right?
Well, Fred, that's one thing that's been a bit challenging for me, I'll say. As someone who was academically trained in the United States, I look for, okay, where's the published data?
Right.
Where, that really says, okay, we've done this study and that study and this study over the years. And these psychiatric hospitals have been around since at least 1920, so that's 100 years. Where's the published data? There's very little.
Yeah. And
when I've asked my associates, professional associates in Brazil, why isn't there more published data? And I've tried to set aside the arrogance that I learned really well in graduate school. I think arrogance 101. So, but if you come from that place of, where's your published proof?
Right.
It can sound very arrogant. And actually, what I came to believe is that if two people who were both, two people showed up in front of one of the Spiritist mediums, let's say, and one was a psychologist saying, we need proof so that we can tell the world how great this is. And the other person was saying, I'm really having a hard time. Will you help me? The Spiritist will help the person who needs help.
The second one.
Yes. Not the one who is academically inclined, who wants proof and evidence and wants publications and such. So there's a great deal of heart in Spiritism. I've been so deeply impressed by that. And I have tried to work with a researcher so that we could do research in the hospital. And unfortunately, she passed away right before, right as we were actually looking for the money to support the research. So anyway, I rest in this feeling that Spiritists have a heart of gold, and they're helping people tremendously. And I've seen people who have stories similar to yours, Fred.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they were in some cases in the psychiatric hospital, obviously considered as schizophrenic.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases in there for quite a period of time, but were so helped by the kind of support that they gained through the Spiritist therapies that they were able to leave the hospital, lead a completely normal life, and marry, have kids, the whole kit and caboodle.
Right.
And some of them went on to lead Spiritist centers.
Wow.
Because they had grown to that extent where they were grounded and could be organized and could appreciate some of the unusual things that Spiritism has to offer and stay grounded. And I mean, you're a case in point.
Yeah.
You've done the same thing in New York.
Right. Right.
And there are others also in Brazil. I know one man I came to know who had been labeled schizophrenic, who thought of himself as a schizophrenic, and then, like yourself, discovered Spiritism.
Mm-hmm.
And now he not only leads a Spiritist group, but he's also teaching physics in the university.
Nice.
I mean, it's...
And what is cool is people can get very hung up on the isms of the world. And it might put a roadblock. I'm not into organized religion. I'm not into any of that. So they just put up a roadblock. And it's interesting that when you read some of the books that were channeled by Chico Xavier, one of the most prolific mediums in the 20th century in Brazil, and there are spirit communications from spirits like Horace Greeley, who was the founder of the New York Times, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, and other spirits that are not Brazilian, but are British and from other nationalities. And they all refer in their communications to the new revelation as an equivalent to the word Spiritism. And I find that there's such a sensitivity in this decision in most of the texts, so that in a way it kind of keeps a more open approach to absorbing these ideas and yet still staying with an open mind to the science that will continue to make these revelations from the spirit realm evolve alongside with it, as the mental health community begins to be more open and decides that just Prozac, Valium, and all these very what's the word? What is the word for the psychotropics? Psychotropic. I think that was what I was going to say. Very, very heavy drugs by themselves, they may have more side effects than actually cure the causes. And it seems to me that they themselves, the psychiatric community, finds itself in a little bit of a crisis, because they have all of these medications, and yet they still don't seem to be able to find the solutions for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and all of these things, right?
Well, I think people haven't figured out what solution means even.
Right.
Is solution being in a place where you don't have to feel disturbed anymore?
Yeah.
Or is the solution getting to the cause and resolving the cause?
Right.
And so I think where Spiritism goes is definitely having developed avenues to find out what the cause is of the disturbance and find out how to resolve that.
Right.
Whereas in the more Western way that is dealing now, standard of care is really psychotropics or psychiatric medication.
Right.
it's not so much looking at the cause. It's more, what are your symptoms? Oh, okay, so this medication will help you because you'll no longer feel bad.
Right.
But that doesn't address the cause.
Right.
So, so anyway, I'm not saying I'm anti-psychiatry. There's a place for medication. For instance, if someone hasn't been able to sleep for 3 days.
Right. No, of course.
That's
of course.
a time to use what will work, and hopefully with little side effects. But it's, I think you said it in a very mild manner that the mental health arena is having a challenge right now. I think there's a profound crisis going on because the medications aren't doing what we thought they would be able to do.
Right.
And in fact, they're bringing us a lot more side effects. And in fact, people who are taking them over the long term find that they're debilitating.
Yeah.
And that's a crisis.
It is. And it seems that the symptoms and these conditions keep increasing in the world, and people begin to detect them at even earlier ages. And so we're in this crisis moment where just putting the drugs down their throats is not helpful. And I from my experience, and I've known from so many Spiritist centers all over the world, one of the things that the mediums do in such cases is to not only address, as you were describing in the hospital, where the mediums focus on the patient and then they're able to intuitively capture so many specifics and help them, but also the spirits that may be attached to those patients in a way that in Spiritism the word is known as obsession. But I've heard it said by a gentleman here in upstate New York, Tom Kratzley, who does spirit release work with his patients. He calls it interdimensional codependency. And so he's able to tap into not only the incarnate patient, but through techniques be able to also converse with the discarnate entity and persuade them in a very loving, compassionate, psychological way to give up their persecutions or give up their attachments to the incarnates and find the light, so to speak.
And you're describing exactly what happens in some of the mediumship groups in the hospitals in Brazil. But as you know, but maybe the audience doesn't, there are thousands of Spiritist centers that aren't connected to a psychiatric hospital where they also are practicing disobsession and energy work and keeping blessed water, as well as offering soup kitchen and all kinds of things.
Right.
So anyway, it's wonderful to talk about Spiritism with you, Fred.
Thank you, Emma. I want to thank everyone for watching. And for those of you that want to know more about Emma's current work, go to www.imhu. It's on the comments here, and it stands for Integrative Mental Health University. And all the courses there are a tremendous resource for you to do it in your own time, especially now with quarantine. And if you'd like to speak to reach Emma afterwards, we have her contact information. Happy to give it to you. Emma, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Send you a hug from New York over the airwaves here. And bless you for your work and for your continued spiritual personal journey.
Thank you, Fred. Always a pleasure to be with you and speak with you.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
And we are